is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today on Wurundjeri Land, and I'm joined, as always, by my two co-hosts. Global Vice President for promoting the Patreon at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Good evening, Luke and Tennant. Great to be with you from Gadigal country as per usual. This evening, minus a lapdog. Everyone will be sad to hear. Yeah, he's curled up elsewhere. But in more tantalising takes, there's a lot of stuff going on at the old Patreon of late. There's a photo of my dog for a start. So you're really curious about what...
$10 a month, ladies and gentlemen.
He's pretty cute, mate. I reckon it'd just about be worth it just for the photo of my doggo.
You definitely can't get a lot of cute pooch content on the regular internet, and that's why you need to subscribe to the Patreon.
You've seen Chewy before. He's ultra cute. So here's the grand bargain. This is not what I was planning on talking about, by the way. But if I get anyone subscribed to the Patreon in the next couple of weeks and writes me a note saying I did this for Chewy Boko, I will commit to posting photos of Chewy like every week on the Patreon, and everyone will be better for it.
Yes, I think the cuteness is too high grade for the normal internet. It needs to be contained in some way, shape or form. So, I mean, this makes sense to me, Frankie.
Yeah, this is not your regular brand of cuteness. But also...
If only we had something more substantive to promote this week.
No, maybe for those cat lovers out there. I mean, Tennant
can help you out there.
Yeah. Just volunteering Tennant's cats into the conversation. So those of you who are either cat people but don't want to see Tennant's cats or just want to hear the regular fodder on climate and energy.
What's wrong with Tennant's cats?
Look, where do I begin? But we do need to wrap this podcast up sometime.
Oh, God. Okay. Recent boko of relevance to climate and energy fiends, such as all of our summer uppers, are our hot takes on the 2 bits of climate ledge that passed the Senate in the last couple of weeks. That was the Net Zero Economy Authority bill and the passing of the bill setting up climate-related financial disclosures, which is a big overhaul of corporate reporting in the country. So if not for the cute photos of puppies and the potential promise of cat photos, do it for the regular climate and energy boko. Patreon.com.
Hot legislative content.
I think the puppies are a stronger selling point, to be honest.
All right. We are also joined by a man who could have cosplayed as a carbon leakage review at an upcoming convention, but has opted for something more realistic, a character from the video game Cyberpunk 2077. Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
Maybe not more realistic. Maybe in a similar timeline. We'll have to see. But yes, my pledge to future Patreon subscribers is to share exclusive photos of the ridiculous cyberpunk costume that I will be donning for 3 days of gaming convention madness in the second weekend of October.
I'm going to watch exactly 0 subscribers to our Patreon in the next 2 weeks. And this way we won't be able to tell whether it's your cyberpunk outfit or my cute dog that's repelling the potential subscribers. Yeah.
And then we'll discover the higher synthesis is Cyberdog.
Patreon.com/let me sum up for I'm not sure what.
A good time.
Oh, that's sounding like a very different Patreon, Frankie.
Gosh, it's...
On this week's show, we dig into a new paper from Science that takes a novel approach to analysing the effectiveness of climate policy. But first, AEMO has released its 2024 Electricity Statement of Opportunities, the annual reliability forecast designed to inform investors and governments and spur action. that ensures that potential reliability shortfalls are addressed. As always, it has set off a flurry of op-eds about our path to an economy powered by renewable energy, some gloomy, some optimistic, and some responding to the initial round of op-eds explaining why everyone really needs to take a chill pill. Tenant, what colour is your mood ring at the moment, and what does that tell you about the future of Australia's electricity system?
National mood ring yellow in the classic headline of The Onion. So this ESU, like all ESUs, all of these future projections, by their nature, always show at some point there is going to be a lack of reliability, because sooner or later power plants retire, demand continues, sometime there needs to be new investment. And that shows up in these modelling exercises as a loss of reliability below the standard at some point in the future. But there is a special interest in that future loss of reliability point here, because we have a lot of coal plant retirements scheduled over the next 15 years. And we have an integrated system plan whose central scenario that is said to be the most plausible says things are retiring even sooner than that.
Yep.
And so how are we doing at getting the stuff into place that will be needed to provide the energy that the exiting coal did is rightly a matter of white-knuckled interest. And this issue is, as they all are, highly, highly interpretable on that question. Its surface story, they've done, like, the single most innovative thing that they've done since the last ESU is they've reversed the order of Figure 1 and Figure 2.
Let's lead with the positive news story.
That's right. So last time they had like a figure that said, well, here's what reliability looks like if only the stuff that's been definitively approved and had its final investment decision gets built. And, oh, my God, the sky's falling in. There will be mass hysteria and 1,000 years of darkness in at least New South Wales and Victoria and South Australia. And then the second chart was, well, what if everything that the states and the feds are supporting with various programs that are pretty firm, what if all that gets built? And then, like, there's no unreliability. Well, it's not quite 1,000 years of reliability, but there's, like, plenty of reliability in most places for most of the time. This year, they just led with the good news and said, oh, and here's the bad news version, and P.S., that's the version that we rely on for things like, do we trigger the retailer reliability obligation? And guess what? We're triggering the retailer reliability obligation, or at least the 3 years out version of that. There's if things get built, they will untrigger it, but for now they're triggering. It is a better picture than last year. More stuff has gotten approved and had its final investment decision, like a lot of stuff. Not as much of a lot as we all might like, or most of us might like, but some big things, including, like, I think the single biggest one for making a difference to these projections, HumeLink, the universally beloved transmission line to connect the full power of Snowy 2.0 when it materialises into existence, and enable a bunch of more renewables to connect and share more power between New South Wales and Victoria. That line has not been approved until just recently. It finally did. And for years, Snowy 2 has been sitting in these projections doing nothing, because the projections did not include the transmission line to connect it up. And now they do. And that's a significant part of New South Wales's, in particular, New South Wales's reliability improving around 2028, 2029. But there's also a lot of batteries and some large-scale solar that's reached approval or final investment decision, and a homeopathic smidgen of wind. So it is a genuinely better story than last time. It's just, we do have to build a lot of stuff that is planned, and we're not there yet.
I mean, it shouldn't be taken as overly comforting to people who are worried about the slow rollout of transmission and other big projects, right? Like the takeaway is we still really need to get on with everything in that pipeline, and any delay is problematic, yeah?
Yeah, that's right. And there is a serious reliability challenge for multiple states if the actionable transmission in the ISP doesn't get built, if the renewable energy zones don't get built, if gas peakers can't run, like all the manifold facets of the glorious jewel that is the integrated system plan. They need to be there, or we got problems. And so for people who are grumpy about this or that project, or people who are proposing, let's just stop these things, well, we're gonna have some problems. And I'll add one more dimension of the problems we may have. The reliability projections in ESU are, in general, they are based only on assets that are officially committed to be there or not be there. And so, among other things, this means they use the announced retirement dates for the various coal plants, which are in most cases later than the dates that AEMO reckons those plants actually flee the market because of the difficulty of life as a coal plant in this hard world today, and losing money in the electricity market. Often, some of them. So we probably have to deal, and for emissions purposes, we want to have to deal with even greater need for replacement capacity even sooner than is in this ESU. If we do what's in the ISP, we're reliability-wise golden, but yeah, we are. We've got a lot more stuff to approve and then actually bloody deliver before that is the case.
It's worth sort of underlining, there's lots of capacity leaving the market. How much? 34% of the currently registered thermal generation fleet in the next 10 years. So that would be a lot to leave, even if it was just leaving on time. But if big chunks of that start departing, not on the timeline that they've communicated to the market, that could create some very big problems very quickly, which, is why you can see state governments start and potentially continuing to sort of getting their hands dirty, keeping those coal-fired power generators on while we build the replacement capacity. The other thing that stood out to me was the prominence that was given to the role of air conditioning load in summer to driving peak demand. I think a similar point could have been made about not just space cooling in summer, but space heating in winter, increasingly becoming a driver of winter peaks as we shift away from gas heating in places like Victoria to reverse cycle air conditioners. In both contexts, those peaks underline how critical the thermal performance of residential homes is as grid infrastructure.
Yes.
High-performance homes that don't leak like a sieve, are going to take load off the grid at critical times. And I just don't think that reality is being taken seriously enough. Yes, it'll take time to spin up the capacity to retrofit all of those homes, but all of this is taking time. And if we invest in that space over the next 4, 5, 6, 7 years, we spin up an industry to be able to improve the thermal performance of those homes as we electrify, it will make such a big difference to the kinds of peaks in demand that we're managing in the 2030s and beyond.
Wouldn't we go further than that and just remind everyone that the energy efficiency savings assumed in the central scenario of the ISP don't have sufficient policies in place to achieve that. So, like, a lot of what you're talking about there, Luke, is the necessary ambition. None of that is a nice to have. Not that any of us would suggest that's the case, but to a certain extent, the scenario guiding a lot of, governments in this already assumes a bunch of action in that space. And we don't have the big move for renovating Australia's homes to make them more energy efficient. Still waiting on that bit of policy there.
And in these reliability projections, it's more complicated again because they don't quite assume all the things that the ISP does around the coordination of consumer energy resources, because a lot of that stuff isn't in the market yet, and they can't regard it for the stringent standard they apply in ESU as committed or even anticipated. So it's always the case you have to read ESU carefully. There's some stuff that's not in it that you should be should be achieved. There's some stuff that is in it that we should not bank on being there. There's an allowance in there for delays in the delivery of everything, and in some cases we could do better than that. In other cases, we're probably going to do worse. So more than ever, we can't shave off any of the asterisks on ESU. It is other than the simple narrative of crikey, get out there and build stuff, people. It needs extremely complex and long-winded exegesis rather than simple headlines. And if there's one thing that people love, it's extremely long-winded exegesis.
That and cute dog pictures in it.
The only other thing I would mention vis-a-vis our comments about energy efficient homes and presumably some assumptions baked into the central scenario is that ClimateWorks have just put out a relevant report to this endeavour. It's Enabling Australia's Home Renovation Wave. It's part of a series of reports they've been doing over the years on renovation pathways. They've had a focus in this area for a long time. It's a really neat report. And it steps out the kinds of retrofit combinations that make sense for different climate zones across the country. So it does that in a really neat, compelling way. And I think so it goes to that piece around as we electrify our homes. It's very likely if you're electrifying heating and hot water, in some climates, you might start to shift peaks away from summer to winter, given you're loading up the electricity grid. Whereas previously those loads might have been split between the gas and electricity network. So all of it backs in the need to focus on the thermal performance of the building fabric and do the sensible things like draft sealing and insulation because then you're paying too much for oversized units, which are only going to add to problems with the need for the build out of the network. And it just really gets my goat when advocates of electrification choose to ignore those common sense measures that you need to do first as a part of these renovations. So anyway, love you guys at ClimateWorks. Keep doing the good work and highly recommend their report. We'll put a link in the show notes.
Absolutely. And the only other thing that I'll say is that when our friends at AEMO aren't worried about space heating and cooling driven peak loads, they're worrying about minimal operational demand caused by, too much solar on the system, which is one of the reasons why they're so interested in the CER roadmap, which, again, featured pretty prominently up there in the front of the report. I think they're particularly hoping that it'll give them some tools to deal with those issues in a more proactive way. So a lot of stock being put in that particular piece of work. Shall we chat about a report?
We should.
Assessing the effectiveness of any given climate policy is a fraught task. Pricing, regulation, subsidies and information are the tools in the toolbox, and we have gained a fair bit of experience with all of them over the last couple of decades. However, a range of challenges, including a lack of comparable data, have made it difficult to draw conclusions that can be generalised beyond a given national context on how any of these measures are working. Enter a brand new paper from Science titled Climate Policies That Achieved Major Emissions Reductions, Global Evidence from 2 Decades. Its authors take a novel approach to assessing policy effectiveness by using machine learning to identify so-called structural breaks in emissions trajectories, and then working backwards to analyse the policies associated with these breaks. Frankie, this paper has caused a cavalcade of commentary within the climate social media complex. What did you make of it?
This was an interesting one to read because I'd clocked a few bits of commentary out there on LinkedIn and Twitter, sort of warning people that, you know, we needed to be reading this paper with a big shaker of salt, or seeking to understand some of the assumptions built into it. It's attracted a lot of attention. One, because, you know, the Potsdam Institute's like a notable institution, lots of good thinkers there, and they've taken a novel approach to looking at, you know, one of the bigger data sets. I think they're looking at climate data that's collected by the OECD, that they say that it's the most robust data set out there. It's all kind of verified by governments around the country. So they do this big statistical analysis across like 1,500 policies implemented over the last 20 years, 41 countries, over 6 continents. And the approach is to try and find large reductions in emissions that happen in short periods of time. And so they identify 63 policy interventions with that. And these are big numbers, right? So we're going to get into some of the methodology and limitations around it, between 0.6 billion and 1.8 billion metric tons of CO2. And because of the statistical analysis they are basically able to, in almost every instance, attribute or match that emissions reduction to a policy that's been put in place within 2 years or so of the emission reduction being clocked. So like that's sort of the premise of the paper. And then, you know, the authors sort of claim that their insights are there to highlight what the combination of different policies might produce in terms of effective results. So you can read the paper. There are a lot of limitations around the methodology of what's been done here. And my impression of a lot of the commentary out there is that they've really sought to engage with almost none of that nuance, and coming to a gloss over this paper with their own like already formed, you know, views on the topic, and keen to highlight very surface level kind of conclusions off the back of this that don't make a lot of sense when you're not considering what this paper is telling you and the limitations of, of what they've done here. So I think like it's worth starting the conversation with that big caveat. It's almost as important to talk about the methodology they've gone through as well as the rather than the findings, because that, I think.
If only they'd started the conversation.
No, I know. And so, the other thing to say is, I don't know that the authors really helped themselves out here.
No.
Because, they clearly are presumably out there to promote this as what they're seeing as sort of highly novel piece of work that they hope the IPCC and policymakers around the world will pick up and go, aha.
The whole start of this paper is an exercise in massively raising expectations, which is a bit of an issue. Like they say, look, we've got this emissions gap we're dealing with due to both a lack of ambition and a failure of policy to produce promised emissions reductions. It means it's really urgent that we work out which policies work. They spend a number of paragraphs shitting over everyone else's methodologies.
They really do.
Lack of, reasonable critiques, like assessing the impact of climate policy is hard. They say, look, there's a lack of comparable data from country to country. The studies that do exist tend to focus on one measure in isolation. There's not a lot of investigation of how complementary policies work together to produce an outcome. And they also rightly say that most of these assessments are focused on developed countries, which is obviously an issue because so much of the heavy lifting we need to do in this space is in developing countries. And so they take on this project of establishing a new approach for assessing the effectiveness of climate policy with the aim of accelerating the most effective policies. But the methodology that they put forward to this doesn't really do any of the things that they claim it will, because it's so narrow and so caveated that it is not capable. It's sort of groaning under the weight of the expectations that have been set at the front of the paper. And while I think it is interesting and is a novel way of thinking about some of these things, it's just too freighted with significance at the front of the paper, and it collapses under its own weight.
Well, so why don't at this point we introduce two of the key misrepresentations of this paper that have dominated discourse about it in the media. One of those is new research finds most climate policies don't reduce emissions. And there's been variations of that headline from New Scientist, a publication that's very interested in climate change and doing something about it, but also the Wall Street Journal, opinion page arguing, most of this is ineffective. Bjorn Lomborg, noted good faith interlocutor on climate policy, cost-benefit analysis and statistics, claims the study shows just 4% of climate policies worked and climate policy has a near zero impact. So that's one genre. And then the other genre is study shows policies I like work and policies I don't like don't work. And mostly that is said by people who like pricing, variations on carbon pricing, or don't like the Inflation Reduction Act and subsidies for things or regulations on things, which are also, important in the US context. But those are the two things. And then the second one at least has a little bit of a basis in some of the conclusions. It's not actually a good read on the conclusions in the paper. But the first one, the most climate policies don't work one, is not at all what you can conclude from this paper. And explaining why will take us into a pretty key limitation of the thing, which is what is success for the purposes of this paper?
Are you referring to structural breaks?
Yes, these are the breaks.
So when we assess a climate policy's effectiveness, it's generally an exercise in boundary setting focused on that particular policy, right? We are assessing the impact of policy X in sector Y over time period Z. This study went the other way. They went looking for these structural breaks in emissions trajectories without, at this stage of the process, any reference to the policies that may have been implemented. And when they found those structural breaks, which occurred over very short time periods, then they went looking for sort of policies that were correlated within that time frame. There's been some really, I think, fair critiques of this approach. The one that I really enjoyed was one you pointed to me on from Emil Demanchev, tenant, and he made a whole bunch of fantastic points about this paper. I think we should definitely link to this thread. But he says that the issue with this approach is it only identifies sudden dramatic shifts in emissions trajectories, and it discounts changes that may be smaller in any given period but build cumulatively over time. So it's only measuring one specific type of shift.
Like it's a pretty fundamental flaw in this study. Like I reckon most policymakers out there aren't in the business of putting in place a policy that they expect to do a crap ton of stuff, over a 2-year period and then not much at all, or, like the whole complete ignorance of steady decreases in emissions over time associated with a policy or collection of policies that are designed together, to my mind, pretty much rules out most of the better uses you could put a paper like this to, if it's excluding that nature of policy intervention.
Yeah, so the lower bound of what their method is able to work with as a brake is a 4.9 percentage point decline in sector-wide emissions for like the entirety of the national transport sector, or the entirety of buildings, or the entirety of industry, or the entirety of electricity. And for comparison, the current Australian safeguard mechanism has a headline decline rate of 4.9 percentage points per annum. And then and that is like an aggressive decline rate. That's much more aggressive than any reduction in emissions targeted by a comparable mechanism in Australia before. But because some of those reductions would take place in different sectors, like the land sector, because of offsets, and because some facilities would have a decline rate of less than 4.9%, like I don't think this method would be capable of perceiving the safeguard if the safeguard works fully as designed. So it's like, it may be interesting and useful to have a look at these cases where there has been a very large, very rapid decline, but that is definitely not the entire universe of what we would consider successful policy. And so the misidentification in the popular press and in bad faith players that only the 69 incidents of these structural breaks count as successful policy, like that is wrong. That's just what they're able to work with in this proposal. One other thing I would say is it is a bit of a weird method to not look at the odds that doing a thing will lead to success, but instead to look at the odds once there is a success that a particular thing was done. And it's sort of like the reasoning that my family applies to declare that in Midsummer Murders, Detective Barnaby's wife, Joyce, actually committed all the murders because she was there in every episode. Every time a body was found in the fatal county of Midsummer, who happened to be around? It was Joyce Barnaby. That is not a million miles away from the correlation of the presence of a whole bunch of policies with these incidents where emissions happen to go down a lot. It doesn't tell you, like, so they found like emissions reductions, these breaks, like a third of them in rich countries involved carbon pricing in combination with other policies, and 20% carbon pricing alone. That does not enable you, for instance, to say that if you seek to introduce carbon pricing, you've got a 30% chance or a 30% plus 20% chance of producing a large break in emissions. You, as a person who loves carbon pricing, you cannot say that using this work.
The other thing that was really frustrating about this paper, unless I missed it because I did not go into the 100 pages of extra explanatory information. I'm looking at you, going. Mr. Reid.
I lightly stepped through them, very lightly.
Was there any consideration of other factors to which you might attribute those emissions breaks apart from policies that have been looked at here?
They did try to remove the effects of, in particular, the global financial crisis and recessions more broadly. Now, there is speculation from our friend Emile that they may not have perfectly removed the effects of those events because, for instance, industrial output would have fallen by more than GDP during those periods. But I don't think he has, and certainly I don't have, sufficient insight into their adjustment process to be sure of that. But they have had a go.
Because the more recent one in COVID was one that occurred to me as well.
Yeah.
And particularly because, sidebar on Australia, of the 69 breaks that this paper identified.
Nice, dude.
A stonking one of those was in Australia, and it was notionally a buildings-related one.
Yeah, I goggled over this. What was going on there?
So it goes to my question though, because as the resident buildings wonk on the LMSU podcast, I looked
You've been holding out on us. Why didn't you tell us about this huge break in building sector emissions starting in 2019?
That's right. Well, apart from me claiming sole responsibility and win for whatever it is that's happening
Just
here.
2 years after Frankie Muscovich started at the Property Council, this structural break in Australia's building emissions occurred, which leads me to believe that you, Frankie, must be personally responsible for that break.
We need to rewrite this paper with a fifth category of policies: information, markets, regulation, subsidies, and Frankie.
Well, I love that for me. I have serious misgivings over this because the time frame stamp on this seems to me pitched around the 2019-2020 mark, which actually was a time for policy. We had quite a significant commitment of policy across the buildings sector with the trajectory for low energy buildings. 2019 was the year we saw the first big upgrade to the National Construction Code for commercial buildings in over a decade. But things like building code regulation shifts, which are noted as one of the more effective policies in the building space, take a lot of time to create cumulative impacts. When you're talking about, construction of particular commercial buildings, this is a very incremental year on year. And if I'm reading the little graph thing right, the colour of the attributed policy seems to suggest it's a financing mechanism, and I just have no bloody idea what that is. And I reckon I should.
Yes.
So it was a bit of a head scratcher for me, and then I wondered whether some of this could be attributed to COVID and the fact that everyone was at home for a really long period of time. Australia had more severe lockdowns than other countries for a time there, and a lot of our big office towers were empty for a while. Yes. So, hence my question about other factors. Australia sidebar over.
You were, for one brief moment, the climate hero there, Frankie. I can't believe you talked yourself out of
Well,
that.
like a true hero, I just followed my own sword there, didn't I? I don't know.
So I want to get into what if anything we can take out of this, because I actually don't think this is in any way, a wasted exercise. I think it's kind of interesting having a stab at considering policy effectiveness by looking at emissions data and working backwards. Why not? Like, that's another lens on this.
Yeah.
And it allows you to say something about markets and nations where there isn't necessarily a lot of granular data and a lot of resources applied to the assessment of policy effectiveness. If they had just been had a more grounded articulation of what this paper was and wasn't doing at the front end, I suspect that they would have set a lot less hairs running in the media, and people like us would be a lot less annoyed having read it, because there are some interesting things in here. I think one of the biggest ones for me is just the degree to which it adds weight to the argument that complementary policies are really important. Right.
Yeah.
Like when it's not just about pricing and it's not just about regulation. It's not just about subsidies. Often, where there are these significant emissions reductions, they find that multiple policies are working together. And there are those purists out there who would say, well, it's all about pricing, for example, and anything else that you do in addition to pricing is just introducing noise and warping the operation of that price in the market. And the evidence from this would suggest, well, no, pricing is a tool in the toolbox, but it is made more effective through a combination, in many instances, with some of those other measures, right?
Yeah, and so they have messages out of this that policy suites, policy combinations are important, and they have been associated with most of the breaks in emissions that their method was able to detect. And they have like slightly ambiguous language about carbon pricing, because clearly at least some of the authors are very keen on carbon pricing, and who could blame them? But there is a danger of coming out of that. Like these messages are in a bit of contradiction, because there has been a long tendency, particularly in the sort of 2005 to 2015 period, for price enthusiasts to say that's the only thing you need. And the policy suites part of these findings sort of says, well, very, very rarely has emissions reduction that they're able to detect been achieved through one of anything. In every sector, it's usually a combination of things. But then the role of carbon pricing in complementing getting more out of these other policies, or vice versa, pricing does seem to be an important thing in the data. It's just not everything. And that all sounds a bit vague and unsatisfying, which I guess is why people reporting this just flip to stuff that sounds much more dramatic but is not true.
And it was one of the areas in which pricing seems to be more effective in developed countries than it is in developing countries. Maybe, because they didn't have they had more developing country data than it would seem anybody else who's been trying to do a comprehensive look. But they as they note themselves, they still don't have that much. And so they're a bit more cautious about their conclusions on developing countries. But yes, they do suggest, well, it seems like subsidies were the biggest deal in getting electricity sector changes in developing countries in particular, rather than pricing. But there haven't been that many full-throated carbon pricing efforts in electricity sectors of developing countries.
No. So it's not really a fair comparison to make between developed and developing. They call out regulation as the the more powerful policy lever on its own and in combination. But presumably that's just a function of what's been done.
One more gripe with this thing. I agree, Luke, that it is not an exercise without value. But almost inevitably, when you are dealing with 1,500 policy interventions from around the world, the actual stuff in all of those policies that matters to people, like the design features, the level of ambition, who was covered, how well designed or corruptible and exploitable it was, like all of that is basically invisible to their approach. Like it's really all about, well, there was this database and we coded stuff in the database as falling into this category or that category. And then we did all our statistical wizardry on the frequency of these categories and their association with different outcomes. And that can inevitably only tell you a bit, because if you just smoosh out all the differences between the European Union emissions trading scheme and the pilot carbon ETS schemes in 7 regions and cities in China, and the safeguard mechanism and the carbon tax with tax-free thresholds in South Africa. Like if you just say, well, all those things are pricing, and pricing has the effect of X in, like, well, how much have you really told people? Once they look below the hood, I think they'll be as confused about those policies representation as you were, Frankie, about what the hell was going on in their data for for Australia's buildings sector in 2019 to 22.
Okay, well, having attempted to make you guys a little bit more positive about this paper, the question I'm left with is one we sort of touched on at the start of this discussion, which is, should we even care about policies that produce sudden dramatic changes? And let me make an argument that maybe we should.
Okay.
Which is that we obviously have a very urgent task of emissions reduction. We're nowhere near where we need to be in terms of bending the curve towards an emissions trajectory that's compatible with 1.5 degrees. Unpacking the cocktail of policies that could drive a very significant short-term shift in that trajectory that then can hopefully be sustained over time might be something that's worth understanding, and identifying, where that's occurred is potentially helpful for unpicking the factors that would allow us to do that.
I agree with that. I think then I'd want to see the sequel or extended version of this paper where, maybe they do a bit more of that deep dive on the measures, like they broke them out into those 4 categories, buildings, electricity, industry and transport. And it'd be nice if they did some work to examine some of the nuances around success factors associated with those initiatives, because as it currently stands, I'm just not too sure what a policymaker could take out of this paper. But if they'd gone that extra bit further to start to examine, okay, well, why is it that this combination of policies seem to work well in a number of countries within the electricity sector? And sort of started to add more detailed analysis. I think that'd be a great paper and extension on this work. I
think you're exactly right. And I think that's this paper sort of starts a process, gets about 10% of the way through, and then doesn't follow through, because they found 69 structural breaks, and then 63 of them were associated with policies that have been established or tightened within a 2 to 3 year period. That's not that many examples, right? Yes. It would be possible to pick a subset of those and actually get under the hood and understand what was going on. But they didn't. They just stayed at this incredibly high level and then just opined about sort of, some of the patterns they were seeing in the data. And what can you do with that? But if you took that next step, maybe, you know, pick some developed countries, pick some developing countries, looked at some of the trends that were emerging in particular sectoral contexts, because we should say that they do go sector by sector. They look at transport, they looked at industry, they look at buildings, and they look at the electricity sector. And so they get down to that level of granularity, but it's not quite enough to be able to say anything substantive about what a policymaker, which presumably is the audience for this work, should actually do.
Well, other than cast an unwarrantedly nervous gaze at Joyce Barnaby standing near them like the angel of death.
As always, we close out the show with one more thing, in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Tennant, what have you got?
I'm going to briefly reference two things that call back to recent content on this podcast. We discussed the paper on trends in climate litigation last episode, and what do you know, since we recorded that, the highest court in Korea has ordered the legislature to put on their thinking caps over the next 18 months and come up with interim climate targets from 2030 to 2050. The legislature appears to be, and the Environment Department appear to be accepting this, and this is an interesting new frontier in that litigation reaching events, the success of that level in major Asian economies, not just mid-sized European ones. The second thing I'll mention, relevant to the BOCO that we recorded on what US climate policy might be like following the presidential election, there's an article in the current issue of Foreign Affairs by Brian Deese, who was an important economic official in the Biden administration and is outside of office right now, potentially an important figure on economics in a potential Harris administration. But he's writing with an eye to appealing actually to both major parties to encourage thinking about what he calls a clean energy Marshall Plan. And people may roll their eyes at the phrase Marshall Plan, which has been uttered about a bajillion times. He goes through an extensive bit of this article to say, no, I'm serious, guys. Here's what the Marshall Plan actually was, and here's why it's relevant. Because what he's thinking about is the use of US financial muscle to both help other countries to adopt clean energy, but to create opportunity for US industry in the process, in a way very comparable to how the Marshall Plan actually worked. It's interesting in its own right. It's got some thinking on carbon border adjustment mechanisms, some of which I think is incorrect, but some of which could be quite positive. But also because it's part of a set of ideas that policy entrepreneurs in the centre left and the centre right are trying to put out there that could potentially be adopted under either party's nominal stewardship. So, pieces worth reading, worth keeping an eye on, the fusion of industrial policy, geostrategic policy and climate policy that may be in the mix for deal making under future US administrations.
So, Marshall Plan aimed at supporting the recovery of Europe post-World War II. What region of the world is he suggesting that all this effort would be directed towards in the 2020s?
All of it.
All of it?
All of it.
Oh, okay.
Except China.
Oh.
Because it's about competing with China. So particularly it's about non-China developing Asia, and it's about Africa, and it's about Latin America.
Okay.
That's quite a lot.
It is quite a lot.
And there's ideas in there about stabilising critical minerals prices through jointly managed by cooperating economies stockpiles of those minerals, so that you don't get suspiciously timed crashes in the price of those processed minerals anytime it looks like somebody might be competing with Chinese producers. There's a lot in there. Some of it is about things we think of as trade policy. Some of it is industry policy. Some of it is finance, multilateral finance. There's a lot in there, and not too many pages.
Okay. Sounds fascinating. Frankie, what have you got?
Mine is a bit of cautionary tale / consternation about building codes here in Australia.
Are you going to lay a parable on us?
No, I mean, I think I'm just grumpy, and I'm grumpy because the advocates out there have been pushing for a very long time to get our national construction code on a pathway to net zero ready homes. So, not imagining we're going to be able to get there overnight, but we had almost no change to minimum standards for homes as it relates to energy efficiency and energy performance for a decade. They were introduced in 2004. You had the last kind of meaningful updates after that around 2010, 2011, and then nothing basically until 2019 for commercial buildings, and then 2022 for homes, where we saw the kind of thermal fabric performance requirements go to a 7-star NatHERS equivalent from a 6-star. And just the fact that we haven't been getting on with the sort of slow ratcheting up, the kind of thing that wouldn't have, caught the attention of our statistician friends at the Potsdam Institute, means it's jarring for industry. And we're in this awkward kind of phase of things whereby you've got this national housing crisis, and there's a lot of consternation about cost increases that have happened through COVID. You saw a lot of increase to cost of building materials and labour. Like, it generally has got more expensive to build homes, but bad faith actors trying to conflate changes to energy efficiency requirements with that, such that the support from building ministers across the country, that looks like it might be potentially wavering, and that the first sign of that is in South Australia, where the government there has said, broadly, I think, we'll implement the 2022 code changes, and then we're not going to do anything else that we think could harm housing supply for a decade, which has caused huge amounts of consternation amongst those advocates that want to see the standards for energy performance of homes continue to rise. And it just, having observed this kind of thing for a while, I've just got concerned that that's going to have some contagion across the country. And I really think we'll go to some point in the future and look back on this period and think that was very ill thought through and a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to what is, genuine challenges being felt in the industry. But I think it's unfair to lay the blame of that to, energy efficiency requirements. Anyone worth their salt in that space knows you can do quite a lot very cost effectively. And ultimately, this really is about the affordability of homes for the people who live in them in the long run. And I just would hope people don't lose sight of that.
It strikes me as a response to a particular set of political circumstances we find ourselves experiencing in 2024, but projecting that forward
10 years.
10 years
it's just, that's just bonkers. And I think will look very jarring in not too long when other things start to stabilise. So anyway, I'm hoping it doesn't eventuate the way I think it might. But yes, just a note of caution and maybe something that people should keep a watch on in the next little while.
Indeed. All right. I just want to give a shout out to our friends at Currently Speaking, the irreverent monthly-ish, I think, energy-themed newsletter. That is a delight whenever it lands in my inbox. We've mentioned them before on the podcast. But I particularly enjoyed a recent article from them that dug into the history of our energy system in the service of reminding us that while we are experiencing a lot of change at the moment, change has been a bit of a constant if you look back over the many decades that we've been running energy systems in this country, even going back to the late 1800s and digging into the history of our sector can yield all sorts of insights into how we might navigate the current transition. So it's a good article. It's worth taking a look at, and it also spurred some conversation on LinkedIn, which I participated in around what some of the better books are on the history of the Australian energy system, which I will also link to in the show notes because there's been some interesting takes on both national and state-based policy. Because a lot of if you go back historically, a lot of stories are state-bound.
Well, huzzah for that.
All right. That has been.
And ever shall be.
Our show for today. Look, if you've got comments, if you've got questions, if you've got reports, you can shoot them through to us at mailbag@letmesumup.net. We also have a website. Tennant, what's there?
The website letmesumup.net is your number one stop for all the publicly available episodes we've ever produced. Back catalogue galore. It's a treasure trove of episodes on global hydrogen reports, local electricity reports, the future of the safeguard mechanism, and 50 plus other things and counting. Go to letmesumup.net.
And Frankie, we've got a Patreon. Can you remember the many and various random things we said either are or shortly will be on the Patreon for our supporters?
I'll give it a whirl. Just to recap, I have promised any new subscribers in the next 2 weeks that reference their subscribing because of allusions to Chewy the Boko lapdog. There'll be weekly or fortnightly photos of him. There may or may not be photos and other sundry content of Tennant's cat cohort.
Tennant has made no such commitment, by the way. He's been keeping very quiet over there.
That's true.
I'm volunteering it. You're roped in. Consider yourself roped in. Don't know that we undertook to do any kind of a more legislative kind of BOCO on the horizon, but there's plenty of fodder out there. So when it happens, it'll be on the Patreon. And you can look at all the other absolute silliness we put on there on a regular basis, which includes, vast swathes of memes, and occasionally Tennant likes to repurpose songs and rewrite them with a climate and energy focus. Those ones are great. We also post the titles that our episodes almost had, and you get to vote on your favourites. And we also put the notes up for the detailed reports that we have a yarn about every couple of weeks. So, geez, you'd be silly not to go over there, wouldn't you?
And I feel like there could be some Curtis Blow proto hip hop
that's right.
rewrite coming to a BOCO near you soon.
Oh my God, no, that was the thing we did absolutely promise, which was your cyberpunk
yes.
costume. And then I believe we may have gone a step further and promised some weird mashup of like Cyberdog. Like that was definitely, I didn't make that up in my head. We talked
You
about
did not.
that.
Feed that into the generative AI.
It will produce an adaptation of early Neil Stephenson novel Snow Crash.
Oh, God.
I think.
It's all coming back to me now. I may have even promised a good time for anyone who was there.
For Frankie Muskovich and Tenet Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Twice in one episode, Luke, having to draw the curtain of propriety over this sheer, unbridled, immoral chaos. Bless you, Luke.
Okay.